All right, everybody, welcome to this month's professional development webinar brought to you by the National Extension Climate Initiative. My name is Hans Schmitz. I'll be playing behind the scenes host today. So if you have any technical issues, feel free to reach out to me via the chat. Uh, let's see, logistics. Yes, extension meeting. The restrooms and snacks are where you last left them because this is a Zoom meeting, of course. And this meeting is being recorded. At the conclusion of this talk, I will pop up a 2-question poll into the meeting, as well as post a link to a slightly longer survey if you would like to fill that out. We are honored today to have Barrett Ristroff. I assume I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You got it.
Great. With us to discuss community-driven relocation or retreat. And without further introduction or ado, I'll turn it right over to you. Thank you for being with us today, Barrett.
Well, thank you all for having me. I've just introduced myself a little bit more first. I'm Barrett Ristroff, and I am back and forth between Louisiana and Alaska. I'm a lawyer, and I got my PhD in climate change adaptation planning and obstacles to adaptation among tribes in Alaska. And I continue to work for some of those tribes. I also do research and evaluation and some law here and there. What I'm going to talk about today is something that's near and dear to my heart because it comes up in a lot of the places where I work and have clients and have lived. It comes up in Pacific Islands, it comes up in Alaska, and it comes up near where I am now in the southern part of Louisiana. And faintly in the background, you can see the Gulf Coast here. And what I'm going to talk about today is community-driven relocation. The nomenclature is fraught. People have called it different things, but I'm going to share, really speaking for myself, and I will talk about how I've been affiliated with the American Society of Adaptation Professionals and how I did the study with National Academy of Sciences, but I don't purport to speak for them, so any opinions or strange things said, please attribute them to me directly. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit more about the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. It may be that some of you are already in it. I mentioned before I'm a lawyer, and lawyers like to have these professional societies. They have the bar. Kind of the goal is to raise the professionality of it and make people take them seriously. Well, because if you say, I want to be an adaptation professional when you grow up, people don't know what that is. They know what a lawyer is. They don't know what an adaptation professional is. So one thing that this group does is kind of legitimize or normalize what it means to work in this adaptation sector. And that is a thing you can do, whether you're a planner or a lawyer or an engineer or many other professions. But it's an extraordinary group. And it's designed to raise the ethics, raise the professionality of folks like myself, and anyone can join. You don't have to have special qualifications. And it has a number of affiliate groups. There's groups that I'm going to call it ASAP for short. There's groups that ASAP directly supports, and then there's some kind of spinoffs. And one of the spinoff groups that I'm involved with is Climate Migration and Managed Retreat. And again, we have these words that are hard to deal with, and I'll talk about that more as I get into the Gulf study. But this group, that I call it CMMR for short, it's aimed at convening professionals once a month, and we talk about interesting things. I usually have one or more guest speakers. So if those of you are here on the call listening now, and you might have something to contribute just anywhere in the area of what's happening with people having to move or contemplating moving or what that looks like, please get in touch, because I love having guests come along. Our group is not so much, people ask from time to time, are we out there solving a real problem? No, but we are connecting people who will go on likely and solve world problems, and that's something in itself. So recently, this ASAP CMMR group hosted some of the folks who'd worked on this National Academy study, and that's where these two come together. the National Academy, as most people are familiar with that, I mean, it was started, I think, by Abraham Lincoln, and it's affiliated with the federal government, and it's funded by the federal government, and get funding from various sources to do these studies. And they decided to do this study on what we're now calling community driven relocation. At the start of the study, we called it managed retreats. And I think most people were unhappy with the word manage retreat, first of all, because it's like, who's managing it? Often it seems to be someone from the outside when the community wants to be the one managing it. And then retreat, it just sounds so un American to talk about retreating from anything. So the language, although we're directed to do a study on managed retreat, it ended up being called community driven relocation. And I say we, I'm part of a committee of several other people that volunteered to do this study. And some of the other people are also affiliated with ASAP. So Deborah Butler, who's now the president of ASAP, was on this committee, and Janice Barnes, one of the co-conveners as well. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint later, but it has the link to it. You can also just Google the title and you'll find it. I put chapters 9 and 10 on the screen because those are the ones that I worked on most. My background is policy and what's the legal maze of laws that inhibits or helps adaptation. So when I talk about this, that's what I'll focus on. I'm just not as much of a specialist in the other areas. So how do we go about doing this study? Well, the committee brought their own expertise from all of the projects that we've done in the past. I had worked specifically on the relocation for Newtok in Alaska, a small village that was moving due to permafrost thaw and erosion, moving to a new site of Nuktivik. And we also went in person to some of the places where people either were moving or considering moving, and we talked with people who are grappling with these things. It was just the Gulf Coast, so Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and to some degree Florida. And many people probably in the adaptation or relocation sector have heard of Ile de Jean Charles and the relocation there. So we did go and learn a little bit more about that. And just to give an overview of what I have some of the main themes on the screen. I think one thing that's important to mention is how much this study focused on mental health and health in general. It's something that I think is just underlooked. I feel like in the general climate change and adaptation sector, people are starting to think about health and maybe mental health, but mental health is one of those things that we struggle to talk about in America in general, and particularly in the area of trauma related to disasters, trauma and mental health impacts of having to move and having to adjust, particularly when people are very place based and really not wanting to move. So while that's something that's not my expertise, I thought it was important for the study to hit on that. Another thing that I thought was really important to hit on is just this history of relocation. The Gulf, like many places, has had a long history of relocation. If you think about Alaska, where there's relocation happening now, or Pacific Islands, people have always been on the move. It's been maybe different reasons for being on the move, and it's been a different kind of migration. But it was important to go back and look at instances of relocation, and to the extent that some of them were forced, and understand the present context of relocation in which people feel somewhat forced to be able to move. So having that background, looking at the history, looking at the health, then my part of it was more thinking about, all right, what laws do we have to deal with this? And maybe what laws should we have? And what kind of planning mechanisms should we have in place? So my background just from law and my dissertation work was looking at what laws do we even have to adapt to climate change? And the answer is so many and yet so little. Most of what we think about as being climate change, adaptation law, or relocation law deals with reacting to disasters rather than planning ahead, thinking about who's going to have to move. A lot of the funding that I've used in my work and other people use for relocation, it goes back to the Stafford Act, which is the act that allows the president to declare national disasters. You can just see some of this wreckage in Hurricane Ida, and if only human beings in general could have more foresight, maybe some of this would have, money would have been spent ahead of time. But that's something that we struggle with, that we're dealing with a human-made framework. And here you see kind of the maze of agencies. When I said a minute ago that adaptation law is very broad and yet very narrow, very broad in the sense that unlike we think about climate change mitigation, where we're more looking at air pollution control, with adaptation, we're thinking of so many aspects. We're thinking of housing, we're thinking of land use planning, we're thinking of disasters and emergencies. So back when I was working for this village of Newtok and contemplating a move, what would they do? What one agency could they go to and say, hey, we need help to move? Well, there really wasn't any. And if you as a homeowner would want to move, you would have to convince your municipality, to convince your state, to convince the federal government to go through one of these programs. If you're a federally recognized tribe, you could maybe bypass the state and go directly to the federal government. But the programs are many, they're complicated and hard to apply for. And I'll get into that a little bit. But first, I want to share just a quote, and you can take a minute to read it. In our study with the national academies, we had these really provocative quotes, people talking. And while you read it, I am going to turn on the light because it just suddenly got very dark with a storm cloud in here. Bear with me. Okay. So this quote is just getting at the distinctions between all the different programs and how hard it is to navigate through them. In this quote right here, some people who are in this sphere may have heard of the National Flood Insurance Program, which is yet another alphabet soup phrase out there that FEMA does, and is interestingly on a very separate track from the disasters. So if you have flood insurance, it doesn't necessarily mean you can use that to relocate. And this quote is just talking about just the calamity that folks in Louisiana are facing now of all the insurers leaving the state and just the policies skyrocketing. So I went through a little bit the maze of different agencies, and I'll flash it on the screen once again. Just we're thinking about everything from FEMA with the disasters, housing and urban development, with the housing and infrastructure, U.S. Department of Agriculture with their Natural Resource and Conservation Service. And then I also put some additional programs for tribes. So there is a federal infrastructure there. It's hard to navigate, but there is something there that people could go to, maybe would have a hard time relocating their whole community, but might be able to use that for home buyouts. Compare that to what we have in the Gulf states. If you think about the Gulf states kind of as a region of the country, there's not really an interstate or even an intrastate jurisdictional authority that could plan for relocation. In this National Academy study, we talked about, hey, there already is an intrastate kind of nonprofit called the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, and it's got a planning team, and it's supposed to support adaptation. And they recently had a conference in Mississippi that some folks might have gone to. But so she's like, hey, they might be well seated to lead this, but community driven relocation has not been a priority thus far. And that is probably because it's not really a priority of any of the states that make up this consortium. So that brings me to Louisiana, where I am now. A lot of people have hailed the Coastal Master Plan in Louisiana, which has been very busy thinking about ways to rebuild islands, some of them which only last 20 years, or some people may be familiar with the efforts to do the Mississippi River diversion. But that too will be covered up by water in a certain amount of time. There has not been over the years very much attention into Louisiana as to moving people out of harm's way. I hope that's starting to shift. In the most recent 2023 plan, it talked about dedicating $11.2 billion out of the $50 billion that I'm not sure where it is, to non-structural aspects of the coast. And that could include elevating homes or maybe relocating. But the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, which is the agency in Louisiana that works on this plan, they don't have any dedicated funding to actually or they don't have the management staff to actually handle relocation themselves. So it just remains kind of an unfunded idea. So I'm now gonna give some heavy criticism all around on the federal framework that we have, and I'll share some more quotes from you with people kind of sharing what was so wrong for them and what made it so hard. I mentioned that it is really hard if you want to move your whole community together. It's hard even if you just want to move your own family, your own household. I had that image before of a person standing before and realizing they have to go through the municipality and then the state and then the federal government. And so you're relying on all these layers of government to be able to submit for you. Not everyone's eligible. If you can't show that you're a homeowner, like if you're just a renter, that's probably not going to work out for you. The platforms that you have to use to apply for a grant are very difficult to use. I remember with New Talk, um, we had hired one grant writer who kind of botched an application, and we paid another grant writer like $35,000 to fix it for a FEMA application. Like this, getting a grant writer to write these things does not come cheap. It's very difficult to write these kind of grants. They're highly specialized. Um, then when FEMA does think about whether they're going to do a buyout, it's based on agency policy, based on usually a benefit cost calculus that maybe privileges some properties over others. And these buyouts often require a certain match from the community. If you are not a well-off community, that's going to be a challenge. I think another big challenge just for individuals is that these buyouts on average can take 5 years. And in that time, maybe you're ready to move on for your life. Maybe you cannot be in transition in a house that is being demolished over time for 5 years. Um, and then even if you do successfully do a buyout, there's no provision for making sure you get into a safe house somewhere else. There's no requirement that you actually move out of the floodplain. There's no provision to make sure that you got enough money to buy a house in a safe place. And all of this relocation process I mentioned before, when we're working with place-based communities, it can be traumatizing and even unacceptable for people to feel like they're being forced out, especially if they're worried that someone is going to come in and maybe buy up that property. And this is just an example of one of the things I saw whenever we were in Ile de Jean Charles. Just they worked out a special deal where they could keep some rights to their property, and that is not true of most buyouts. But many people there were still not planning to move or not happy with it, and this person in particular was really not happy with the idea of it. I'm going to share a few quotes just about the buyout concerns that you can look at. I mentioned before about the 5-year time frame. So this is an example of, and I'll just pause for a minute for you to look through it. Another challenge is just people thinking that they're not going to be able to get enough money to get into their next place, especially if they're doing a business from their home or something else, and they're not going to be able to afford another piece of property that would allow for that. This is something that one lady was telling us about in Houston, and this was very interesting because Harris County, where Houston is, actually has a forced buyout program, which people were not very happy about. And then this idea, even if you're not necessarily a place-based person, but just you're used to living somewhere all your life, what are you going to do if you do get that buyout? Where are you going to go? Who are you going to stay with? It's very daunting, especially if you're an older person who's been settled there all your life. So for the rest of my talk, I'm just going to rest on this slide, but I am going to go through the National Academy's recommendations. I'll go through all of them that they made, and there's about 13 or so major ones. And I'll focus most, and if you ask me questions afterwards, I'll be able to focus most on the policy and planning ones, and not as much on some of the other ones. But I want to keep emphasizing how important it is that we have this diverse set of recommendations that goes across these different fields. Some of them we're dealing with centering well-being. So again, thinking about the historical context and mental health. And we talk a lot about communication. And then we talk about actually what are the mechanics that we need to consider when we're getting people ready for relocation. So there were 13 recommendations in all, and I'm just going to go through them one by one. The first one, and we're required for National Academy studies to give a specific who. We cannot just say such and such should be done. We have to give it a who. So a lot of times the who is falling on FEMA and federal agencies or Housing and Urban Development HUD. So the first recommendation is suggesting it's actually pointed towards, this is about centering and well-being. So it's talking about the Health and Human Services and suggesting that they support and coordinate efforts across health and human services. There are different offices within Health and Human Services that would be a good fit. There's an assistant secretary for mental health and substance use, and suggesting these different offices should coordinate to better support policies to access mental health in the context of climate change and relocation. And then the second recommendation is about how planning for relocation needs to incorporate local perspectives about the histories and impacts and perceptions of displacements. And that is so important when you're thinking, especially a lot of my work is in the tribal context, when you're thinking about maybe tribes who were forced to relocate in the past or in Alaska were pretty much forced to settle down in certain places by the education system. It's important to be able to go back and get that local history if you're thinking about recommending or helping people with relocation. And then the third recommendation, it's pointed towards a number of the federal agencies, HUD and FEMA and USDA and the Army Corps, and also the state resilience and community development offices, suggesting that they foster meaningful partnerships to work on plans in collaboration with communities. And this is not just having a general plan. It's really thinking about what's the timing of relocation. Is there going to be a threshold, and what's the pace? How far is this? Many of the relocations I see, unless it's right after like a major flooding disaster, they're not happening overnight. They're happening gradually over time. So thinking about the pace and what works for communities is important. And then the fourth recommendation is that regional planning entities, to the extent these exist, there's not a lot in the Gulf, but they should look at land use planning and hazard mitigation plans. I Part of my dissertation was looking at like a community plan and then holding it up next to the hazard mitigation plan and noticing like, oh, okay, these two things are not really integrated with each other. But so ideally, if you have a regional based entity, it can look, okay, this place, people are probably going to need to be leaving from it. Let's plan for more infrastructure in the place where people are likely to be moving. And let's do some land suitability analysis to figure out where they might be moving to. And then fifth was that federal agencies, local government, and regional planning entities should be working with what we call the originating communities, sometimes referred to as the sending communities, where people are coming from, and think about the threshold agreement. Like, at what point in time would people decide that it's no longer habitable to be in the place where they are now? And that will be different for everyone. What may be intolerable for one community may be perfectly habitable for another community. But that's really the decision, I think, for the local community and local government to make. And we talk about how these federal agencies should have a clear requirement too, that when households do relocate, make sure they relocate to a safe area and not just 2 houses down, which could be the case. Our sixth recommendation was that state agencies and regional planning entities and professional associations, and there could also be academic community partnerships, and that they should work together on capacity building. I mentioned before how hard it is for a small community to be able to even afford a grant writer to apply for some of these grants. It is so top heavy right now in terms of the relocation law and policy. It's so much at the federal and so little, except for maybe at least among the Gulf states, except for Texas, there's so little going on at the state level. So there is a need for capacity building. So this could shift a little bit more to the localities to do. And then recommendation 7 is talking about these various entities from the federal down to the regional, preparing to increase their investments in receiving communities being the place where people are going to move to. Granted, sometimes the originating and receiving community are in some ways the same. People do move within the same city, but in a place like Louisiana, where the coast is likely to be uninhabitable, it is likely that there's going to be receiving communities that are somewhat farther north. And we need to think about the infrastructure. And I use the term infrastructure very broadly, the social connections, the support for people who are going to be moving there. Then the next set of recommendations deals with preparing for community-driven relocation. And I get a little more into the policy here. So recommendation 8 is that FEMA not just moving at a disaster speed, thinking about outside of a disaster. How do you go about conducting the environmental review and the historical clearance that you need to do on a bunch of properties in a flood prone area? So when disaster strikes or when a community is ready to move, you've already done that NEPA analysis, which can be so long and can also be kind of a hot potato that agencies toss around because nobody really wants to do the full blown NEPA analysis. And we talk about how FEMA should consider these flood prone areas, that they should consider it is cost effective rather than having to do a benefit cost analysis to really think about the value of the house. They should deem it cost effective to move places that are in such a flood prone area. And then in recommendation 9, we talk about getting FEMA and the Army Corps and HUD to pay for, I'll call it navigators. I don't know if any of you have ever enrolled in healthcare.gov. I have, and I think I accidentally put that I was in jail. It can be complicated to get on there and put the right thing. But there are actually healthcare navigators, and you can call them and they will do the thing for you and you save money. Why can't we make that for households and even communities who need relocation? Have someone be able to navigate them through the process, have ombudsmen route them to the right place. And that leads us to recommendation 10. Federal agencies providing the funding should think about the benefits of thinking about having annual funding go out. Right now, it's often based on whether, even if it's not just the money right after a disaster, but your accrual for next time is based on a percentage of previous disaster funds. So it ought to be that any family or community or state could apply for funds to be able to address relocation year round and not based on previous disaster statistics. So pre-disaster mitigation programs would be just year round. And ideally we could move from a competitive grant making process where the person with the most well-paid grant writer wins to something where they're assisting under-resourced communities. Just a few more recommendations left. Number 11 is that agencies offer funding for relocation planning. And this is always hard. It's going to be hard to get money to come up for all of this, and it's not very popular. But coming up with planning funding to streamline relocation and ideally coordinate these different agencies in terms of their eligibility for grants and their timing of requests for grants. Also, I mentioned before that right now the National Flood Insurance Program is completely separate from relocation. And we suggest that people who are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program and have a certain level of damage, they should just be able to go directly to a buyout, and they should be able to get it that way instead of having to go through another program. We'd like to see agencies allow funds from partnering agencies to use for matching funds. Right now, if I'm a municipality and I get money from FEMA and I need a matching fund, usually 25%, usually I can't get it from another federal agency. We'd like to see different agency funds be leveraged together. I talked a little bit earlier about the National Environmental Policy Act and the environmental review that's required. And I mentioned it's kind of a hot potato because, particularly for New Talk, many agencies, nobody wanted to take on the full thing of doing the environmental review for the full community. And so it became very piecemealed. And we'd like to see the Council on Environmental Quality have some kind of memorandum of understanding to explain how to do the environmental review when you're moving a whole community. We'd love to see some kind of interagency cooperation on that. And ideally, this may be a long time coming, but on some kind of uniform grant application, and maybe it'd be 100 pages long, but it would be something that someone who wants to move could apply for and do the whole thing with the help of a navigator, and that could be routed to the right agency. Then the 12th recommendation, I mentioned, I alluded to before, that the benefit cost analysis can really privilege more well off buildings and infrastructure over ones that are of poor quality, just because it looks like it's more advantage to buying them out and moving. And our committee came down hard on that and wanted to make sure that FEMA would account for communities' qualitative values for their vulnerability and also values like social cohesion and social capital. The last recommendation, and then I'll stop and have a discussion, is about the federal programs involved with relocation, including FEMA and the Army Corps and HUD. We'd like to see them increase acquisition payments to property owners so they could actually afford to go live somewhere safer. And renters are often left out. Those in mobile or manufactured homes are often left out. We'd like to see everyone pretty much who needs to move be eligible for it. And finally, we'd like to see management costs, which are available in some of the FEMA awards. We'd like to see those support buyout grants to offer property owners something above the typical pre-disaster fair market values. In Newtok, we have the situation where the fair market value of some people's houses was maybe 100,000, but in a community that remote, a new house, even without a toilet, cost $500,000, and nobody's going to be able to afford that. So some states have stepped in and tried to add additional money to be able to get people to be able to afford a new house, but there's no federal requirement for that. So with that, I will stop. And Hans, I don't know if you want to ask questions, and if people are shy and don't have questions, I'm also glad to ask some questions of you all or just hear your opinion about some of these issues.
Trust me, this group has questions. I actually have a question I want to start off with, and then as this group normally does, if you have a question you'd like to ask verbally, please raise your hand and we'll call on you. If you have a question you'd like to place in the chat, that'd be great too. This may not be exactly related to your expertise, but it is related to the topic. Do you find that local communities along the Gulf Coast, particularly in the planning and zoning process, are beginning to do comprehensive planning wherein they are zoning for retreat or for oceans and not allowing new development in those areas?
I find it's the opposite, and that may be the mentality and the politics of many places in the South. Any local government wants more revenue, and I guess there's kind of a pattern of poor planning, particularly in Louisiana and places in the South, where it's just like more development, lots of this fill and build kind of stuff. Like, okay, we'll just fill up our little subdivision and flood the neighbors. So I see quite the contrary. I see very little incentives for planning for relocation. The other problem too is, do you really want to be planning to move people out and then not paying real estate taxes? And some people have come up with really creative thoughts about how different municipalities might share real estate taxes for a while to ease the transition. But right now, when you think about how most of local economies are funded from having more and more development right there on the coast, we have very little incentive for local planning for relocation.
Okay, good to know. Others with questions? I don't see any in the chat at the moment. So there might be the chance for you to ask us a question. Oh, here we go. Eric has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was a great presentation, and it's stunning to me how serious the problem is and how much lack of action there is or attention to it. My question is, in terms of what's not happening, can you attribute that to this climate change denial atmosphere? Or are folks moving beyond that and it's just other factors that prevent local governments and states from doing anything?
That is such a great question. The climate change denial stuff is pervasive. I worked on the EPA's board of scientific counselors in the last presidential administration before this one. They weren't even using the word climate change. And I thought, really? The federal government? So some of you you may have experienced that, but I've had that even in Alaska, like, oh, we need to say a changing climate, or even in some of the Louisiana coastal plans, good luck finding the word climate change. So absolutely that the denialism is an issue in the Gulf area. But more than that too, it's kind of my answer to Hans's question about, our whole political structure is geared around the here and now and the profits here and now. And we're just not, as species in general, geared towards long-term planning, it seems, other than maybe for our immediate families. So there's just, we don't have a political incentive structure in place right now to really incentivize relocation.
Okay, thank you. I want to highlight the fact that the poll is now open. So if you haven't filled that out, please do. And David, you're the next one with your hand up. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Barrett. I wonder if you could comment, maybe from a couple perspectives, about what you see as the role of academia and sort of engaging in this, particularly because of the connection you've now had and maybe had before working with the National Academy. And if you know much about the cooperative extension system, if you could kind of give our system any advice about what our most constructive role might be.
That is such a great question. I'm glad you said that, because I'm thinking back to my own academic experience whenever I was working on my PhD and I was busy looking at the laws and think, oh, you can use this FEMA program to relocate. And then I got in the real world and was trying to complete the application. And I'm like, okay, I got a JD and a PhD and I can't figure out how to do this application. I feel like the extension services could be such a bridge if they could figure out how to do these applications. They could be such a boon to communities to be able to work with them, because communities, they simply cannot afford the highly specialized grant writers. And I imagine there are probably restrictions on cooperative exchange agencies. They cannot write a grant for someone, just like with the EPA TIC tax, these special centers that were recently set up. They cannot write grants for communities, but certainly they can do everything but that. They can help the communities get in the place where they need to be to write these grants. So I feel like if the extension services could understand the grants out there that are available that can help with relocation and help communities get to write that and help them plan around what grants they need, almost the extension services could almost step in and be the navigators that I was talking about, that I'd love to see the federal government provide, but I don't see it as being forthcoming.
Thank you.
Other questions? I assume that David and Eric's hands are a relic of their earlier questions.
Hans, I wanted to ask the group, and maybe if anyone would share, I'm coming at this from a background of planning and law, but I wanted to see what the background of most of the group was. And apologize, I'm kind of ignorant about your group. I'm guessing a lot of it is people who specialize in agriculture, rural development, maybe some USDA folks, but I'd be really curious if anyone could share their background and whether in their work so far they've intersected with any of this relocation planning and what that's looked like for others on the call.
That's a good question. Being from the Midwest, I'm going to defer to other people. I shouldn't say that. We have the Great Lakes. It's a thing, but would anyone like to share their perspective on relocation?
While you're thinking about it, well, don't be shy, but I say while you're thinking about it, I want to emphasize too that it's not just a coastal thing, the relocation. And I work with communities in interior Alaska, and there they have permafrost thaw and erosion in the rivers. And so that is having some communities having to move back. And then, in the Midwest, you have all these riverine flooding disasters. So things are wonky all over the place. And it's in a sense, who's safe? And then you mentioned the Great Lakes, and it's interesting because lots of people are putting their eyes now on upstate New York and the Great Lakes as these maybe future receiving areas for communities. Like, are these the places that people can go and not have to worry about natural disasters? So I think that's really interesting. So maybe some of you don't live on the coast or you don't live in a disaster prone, but I'm curious to hear people's thoughts about what about being a receiving community in your area? I see David raised his hand.
Yes.
Well, other people are thinking if nobody else has raised theirs, I'll just say that I mean, I've worked with and a part of Extension more on the community development side, which has brought me in touch with a lot of municipal government decision making and planning contexts. And I'm in upstate New York, pretty far from the ocean. And this question is, you know, it's around flood. You know, we come to it often in our part of the world through flood risk, but I know back where I used to grow up, it's now fire risk as well. About just this question of how does, on the one hand, community level planning and zoning decisions accommodate sort of growing risk that is being perceived even by people that don't believe in climate change driven risk. They see changes in the number of serious events that are happening. Of course, there's coastal risk too in New York, particularly you know, in the Great Lakes and down in the New York City, Long Island area. But there's also the individual level decision making about where am I going to buy a house, and like my city right now is just went through a FEMA remapping. So the issue of affordability, you know, how do you balance the question of affordability of housing on the one hand, given higher costs of insurance if people are now in floodplains, and on the other hand, thinking about the greater risk that that is signaling about the probability actually being there, which they didn't think it used to be true, of maybe we are going to get flooded because, you know, I hadn't had to think about that before. So this is like, I wouldn't say it's a dominant or major area in our work, but we also have the Extension Disaster Education Network, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but yeah, it's a whole group of people around the country in Extension who are thinking about the disaster response elements of some of this. They think beyond climate, but so there's a group of people in our system that do think about this.
That's great to hear, and you raised so many good points. Like, you know, once we try to be more honest about where the flood risks are, we're basically opening the door to raise the insurance rates for people who live there. And have we done them a favor or a disservice? I think we're always going to be challenged by these high costs of flood insurance. All of this is going back to our underlying challenge of we're all going to have to pay more because of climate change, one way or another, whether it's in higher flood insurance or whatever it is, whether it's paying to move. I think we're all faced with this challenge. And one maybe limitation of this National Academy study is that we basically, like every other study in the world, we're asking the federal government to pay more money. We're asking governments to come up with more money. We're basically asking the American taxpayer subtly to pay more. And that is a really hard ask. We already have such a crisis in the United States of the unhoused population. We have a huge number of unhoused people. We're probably going to have even more as climate change and disasters displace people. We can't house people already. How are we going to provide housing and affordable flood insurance for more? I don't really know how we're going to do that unless somebody's willing to pay more or we're all paying higher taxes. It's a really hard sell.
If I could just, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Jackie's been very patient, slowly turning the camera on and then unmuting, and now has her hand up. So,
hi. So I work in county-based extension in rural upstate New York, and so I'm circling back to your question around that. How do we encourage communities that seem to have the capacity for more people to come in? You know, our towns are consolidating, our schools are consolidating. We have concerns about limited workforce capacity. So on one hand, it seems like we would be the ideal situation to prepare for people to come in, but we also have the same challenges happening where we have substandard housing, we have significant amounts of people that are unhoused here already, and we can't serve their needs, and fear, because we are place-based communities ourselves. So it's really hard to come into a rural upstate New York community and integrate into the community and feel welcome and included. And I've been guilty of it myself because I'm from small town Pennsylvania. I still live in my hometown. And if you weren't born there, you are not from there. So there's a lot of work that would need to be done in a community in upstate New York to even set the stage for the community leaders to say, this sounds like an interesting option that could benefit us in a long term. They need to see our data on what the benefits could be.
That is such a good point. I think anytime you have a situation where it looks like people relocating are getting more benefits than people who live somewhere, you're going to have a problem. I remember looking at a study in Papua New Guinea that they were looking at moving people from the Carteret Islands, and they ran into that problem of you can't, give these people who are coming in brand new houses, and then the people who already live in the village just have their same old houses. Like you've got to provide a benefit for the people who already live there, and you said that so well, and I'm glad you said that, because we can't idealize this idea of places in upstate New York being receiving communities. As you point out, they may not want to, and I feel like they would have to be incentivized and appropriately compensated for whatever they take on.
Okay, I'd cut David off from following up before Jackie spoke. David, did you have a follow-up you'd like to state?
No, that's okay. Sorry.
Okay.
David, I noticed Dennis Testerman in the comments had an interesting comment, just looking at some of these disasters from an international perspective, and the time that Dennis spent in Nigeria and Pakistan, and talking about the trauma there. I think that's worth mentioning, because what maybe I see in the United States as a housing crisis, or what I see is poverty. It can be at a whole different level if you're looking at some of these other countries and the needs that are there. I mean, most of us professionals are dealing with the contiguous states and the level of poverty there, which is one thing, but take it to another place, it's another level. And I mean, that said, we have some of that kind of poverty even within the states. I mean, you can go out to some of the tribal reservations and not have power, not have running water. You can go out to Alaska towns, and I mentioned that you'll spend more than $500,000 on a new house and it still won't have a toilet. So we have these challenges within the United States, but it's worth mentioning that there's a whole nother level when you take it internationally.
Excellent point. Eric, you've got your hand up?
Yeah, another question, Barrett. I know National Academies goes out looking for funding to do a lot of these studies, and wondered if this was, supported by FEMA, if they're the ones that wanted the study done, or did Congress ask for this? Just curious who supported this.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't pretend to understand all the mechanics of it, but I believe it was the Gulf Research Program of the National Academies that funded that. And so they funded the particular people within the academies that, but they were paying for it. Where they got their funding, or just from their general budget, I'm not sure. But you're right that I believe National Academies, sometimes it'll go looking for funding from an agency to do a particular study. But in this case, I don't think there was any direct sponsorship from any of the federal agencies.
Okay. No, I work for a federal agency in ag, and we get requests all the time from the National Academy for,
Yeah.
6-figure awards, grants. So it's they do need to round up money. Thanks.
All right, we've got time for one or two more questions, if anyone has any. Otherwise, we certainly aren't against ceding a little bit of time back on the clock. Last call. There's your 7 seconds. Eric, you got something?
No, I just wanted to say thanks. Good.
Well, thank you all for being there and hearing me out. And I will put in closure, I will put my contact information there. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm sure Hans could lend my email address. Let me see if I can write this and make it without any typos. So that is my email address. If you had a question that you didn't want to ask everyone, but you want to ask me, or you want to chat more about this, it's a subject near and dear to my heart. So I'd be glad to just kind of have a virtual coffee chat with someone, or talk more at any time.
That sounds great. Thank you, Barrett. And your permission for me to give your email address is on the recording now. So it's for the record.
Right on.
I have it. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Next month, we will be having another webinar on the first Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. I think I know who the speaker is, but I got to confirm, so I can't give it away just yet. So with that said, look forward to continuing your participation. Thank you, Barrett, for joining us today. Excellent topic.
Thank you all.
Great nuance. And everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Cheers.
So long.